Welcome to this webinar on budgeting strategies for challenging times. This is the second webinar in the Colorado Resiliency Office's Adaptations and Futures webinar series. My name is Ann Miller, and I am the Director of the Colorado Resiliency Office in the Department of Local Affairs, Division of Local Government. Colorado defines resiliency as the ability of communities to rebound and positively adapt to or thrive amidst changing conditions or challenges. We are all learning firsthand how to live with uncertainties and be adaptive. This webinar series provides real-time guidance on issues confronting local governments and communities in Colorado. Each webinar is accompanied by short tools and resources to help communities take local action. We also set up a local recovery and resiliency peer exchange and held our first video conference call last week. You can express interest in joining that peer exchange by clicking on the link provided in the chat. Next slide, please. So a few housekeeping items before we get started. Please use the chat to communicate any questions, and feel free to add ideas or new approaches that your organization is taking to deal with budgeting challenges as well. If you could also ensure that your microphone is on mute throughout the webinar, that'd be great. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the CRO website in the link that I provided. Next slide, please. This webinar is focused on helping communities learn budget strategies and techniques to address financial challenges and uncertainties. These times are forcing us all to be adaptive and creative, and we look forward to hearing from our panelists and from participants during the question and answer discussion at the end. We have a great, next slide, please. We have a great lineup of panelists, and we're really pleased to be joined by a special guest, Jeff Hansen from the City of Golden, the Finance Director. We also have some top-notch staff from the Division of Local Government in the Department of Local Affairs. So Parker Crow is the Budget Program Manager, and Cynthia Thayer is a Finance Unit Manager in the Local Government Services section. And Clay Brown is one of DOLA's 8 regional managers, and Clay will be moderating the Q&A discussion at the end of the presentations. So with that, I will turn it over to Parker to kick us off.
Great, thank you so much, Ann, and thanks everyone for coming. This is excellent turnout. I see 95 people and skyrocketing there in the attendees here. I see a lot of familiar names, so thank you all for joining. I know the mix here of people attending are kind of some finance staff and some non-finance staff. So I think our talk today will be kind of a good high-level introduction to those of you that aren't as familiar with what local governments go through when they're trying to balance the budget in times of economic uncertainty. To start, I just want to kind of have you think back to 3 months ago and think about that ancient history before we knew about the current situation, where all of the life that feels really normal now really was just this, implausible, no way will we be able to stay at home and not really conduct much economic activity was really plausible. I think we have a little bit better handle on what's going on now, but still, as everyone knows, no one exactly knows what will happen throughout the rest of this year or next year and beyond. If you look at the slide at this point, the Governor's Office of State Planning and Budgeting, OSPB, at least has some idea of what has happened so far, at least. You can see the chart at the top right there. You can see some sectors are hit harder than others, and some are having a good year so far, such as grocery stores particularly, as we all know. Those charts below with the different shapes of the recovery are really just examples of how this could go. We're kind of still towards the bottom. Maybe we've recovered a little bit, but no one can really see the future. I guess the point of adapting your budget and adapting finance to a situation is to be able to be resilient and to be able to adjust to how the real world situation progresses. If you think about a local government budget, there's a number of inflows and outflows to the budget. If you think about those revenue sources that local governments depend on, such as sales tax, property tax, fees, they all have different profiles as to how they would react in any given scenario. A general rule of thumb for those non-finance staff out there is that sales tax is very volatile and property tax is more stable. I think that is proving very true here. It's very hard to see, that sales tax has been hit very hard, whereas property tax has been more stable. So those governments that are depending more on sales tax, then property tax will have a bigger hit to their revenue. And it's up to the finance staff at every local government to come up with a scenario for how they think this will play out and to model those different revenue sources and expenditures in different scenarios that they can foresee in the future. So it's great to have Jeff Hansen joining today. We'll have a real world example from Golden. Next slide, please. So financial and economic shock is nothing new. GFOA, the Government Finance Officers Association, is a really excellent resource. They've been thinking about this exact type of thing for many years and have very well-developed resources out there. This slide here is depicting the process of fiscal first aid, which they branded with a nice blue medical sign up there, a fiscal first aid logo. This is an attempt at a methodical structure to respond to a financial crisis such as we're in now. And you can see there are 12 or really 13 steps there, and we're probably towards the beginning here still, since this is a really ongoing, constant process to manage the financial situation of a local government. So today we're going to talk about treatments. So what happens when things get a little tougher? How does a local government respond in different scenarios? So we'll start by talking about generic treatments and then move on to some longer term treatments, and then we'll have Jeff participate with a real world example from Golden to really keep the talk today practical as to actual responses to the current situation. Next slide, please. So when I say treatment, that is an activity that a government will undertake under certain scenarios. It's just really a reaction, and sometimes these are vetted in advance, and sometimes they are just a decision made by a local government to respond to a situation. And these treatments they're not created equal. They're very different in different scenarios. Some produce great savings and are very effective, and they have different levels of side effects or pitfalls that could be associated with those different treatments. So it's something to think through. So what we'll be talking about today are really just generic examples, and they won't apply to every local government. Every local government will be in a different situation. I also want to say that some treatments might not have a great effect on the top line or bottom line of a budget, but they might have more of a symbolic effect on establishing a culture of frugality and a shared sacrifice so that everyone can understand what the current situation is and how serious it is. Next slide, please. So when I talk about generic treatments, this is really the first line of defense to plummeting revenues, really. As those revenues start to fall, you won't have much data. If you think back to my example earlier of early March when this was really just starting, there wasn't that much data. No one knew exactly how much money they were going to be losing, but there still can be treatments available to respond that will be relatively harmless and make something of an impact on balancing the budget. The point of a generic treatment is that it will have a short time to benefit. You will save cash now. It is not complex. It's easy to understand for the public and for your elected officials, and it's easily reversible. So, if it turns out that the recovery comes back quicker than expected, the treatment is reversible, and you can go back to business as usual quickly. Next slide. So a few examples of generic treatments. I think as public sector employees, we dread the reduced personnel cost label there, but there are some personnel cost treatments are more effective and less disruptive to business than others. These are really the first line generic treatments that can be done quickly with those traits that they're short time to benefit, easy to understand, and reversible. Things such as the short-term hiring freeze, you're not affecting any current positions, you're just not hiring new positions. You can permanently eliminate vacant positions, share personnel, all those different types of things that don't affect the current workforce, and they're easily reversible. If the economy rebounded quickly, you can open up those positions right away. So these are just types of things that local governments can consider as an example, and I think the example from Golden will be a good example of how Jeff has approached these types of things. Next slide, please. Just continuing with a few other ideas that was just on personnel, but you can think through capital expenditures, just delaying capital projects, not canceling them, but delaying. They can easily just be restarted again in the future. Reducing materials costs. It depends on the local government where your cost centers are and what can be delayed without much harm. And then creating cash inflow and outflow advantages is just really to understand your budget and understand the timing of those revenues versus expenditures, and really delaying that that outflow after the inflow happens. And then considering new resources. We haven't talked about accessing new sources of revenue. One common thing that local governments think about is what's known as the rainy day fund of your reserves. It should be, there are real pluses and minuses to accessing reserves, and the biggest one is that reserves are only just a one-time revenue source. Once you use that reserve, it's gone. It's not an ongoing source of revenue. So something to be mindful of as you progress. Next slide, please. So now we'll move on from those first, the very first steps of those generic treatments and think about a little bit longer term, and my colleague Cynthia Thayer will take over.
Thanks, Parker. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Excited to be here. As Parker said, after this immediate initial entry into the downturn and stopping the outflow of cash while you're gathering data and figuring the situation out, we move into really where we are now, the stage 5 in the GFOA, Government Finance Officers Association financial recovery model, is the application of these near-term treatments. Next slide. Thanks. And really what we're doing with these near-term treatments, ideally they're used for a year or two, they're not permanent, and we're buying time for either a long-term or for either an economic recovery, or some cases if a organization is going through a fiscal distress that is unique to them due to some kind of structural imbalance, these near-term treatments buy time for the organization to evaluate that, diagnose the causes of the imbalance, and implement transformational or structural changes. And two overarching themes during this time. One is the stabilization of the financial position, and this is where the finance office is really leading the charge. The identification of revenue scenarios, cash flow projections, modeling revenue and expenditures under different recovery scenarios. Probably in this case, a lot of local governments are using those charts Parker talked about, the big V, the W, the L, or the square root, and sort of modeling these from most optimistic to most pessimistic. During this time, it's important, as Parker discussed, for an organization to establish this culture of frugality, and with that comes often either review of existing controls or establishment of new controls, including purchasing controls, or watching closely budget variances and things like that. And then making decisions based on data and having evaluation and close, timely monitoring of data is really what inform the use and prioritization of the strategies. Collaboration with departments is so very important, and it's not exclusively the finance office that's in charge of this recovery and stabilization, but really throughout the organization, this culture of a shared, we're all in this together during this time. Often during this time is when local governments will, if they've never gone through the process, will take a close look and inventory programs and services and levels of services to develop a prioritization. It's an opportunity and a reminder for the governing board to consider what are their goals and priorities, and how do their programs and services meet those goals and priorities of the board and the community. Next slide. So some examples of these near-term treatments or strategies, and a lot of these really do build upon those initial generic treatments that Parker talked about. But again, because personnel costs are for most local governments the biggest part of the budget, control of personnel costs is usually a strategy involved in this stage. And things like vacancy control and the limit or monitoring of overtime, ideally as a primary treatment, is not an across-the-board hiring freeze or vacancy control, but rather a case-by-case evaluation. So ideally keeping in mind public health and safety services that vulnerable members of the population rely upon, as opposed to a blunt instrument of a hiring freeze. And the same goes with overtime usage and consideration of those public health and safety considerations, especially in a pandemic and the situation we're in. In the area of enhancing purchasing practices, and I won't talk about all of these, but just highlight some, this can be an opportunity to revisit potential savings by enhancing competition. If an organization hasn't rebid contracts or renegotiated contracts with vendors, this is a great opportunity and chance to do that. The review of ongoing expenditures. Some of these are examples, like Parker said, that don't necessarily create individually huge savings, but again, reinforce that culture of frugality, and in aggregate can make a difference. The review of those sort of autopilot expenditures, revisiting, are cell phone plans appropriate, or are they more than you need? Are there unused memberships or software subscriptions that just every year get purchased and it turns out aren't needed anymore? And then partnering and pooling resources. Economies of scale can be achieved by regionalization, looking into state contracts for purchasing. Also, an idea that's relevant for some local governments. Let's say if a local government is using a contingency line item for every individual department within the general fund, that can create, in aggregate, a larger contingency and a larger budget deficit that maybe is needed. And so instead, having a pooled one single smaller contingency line item across all departments in the general fund is another example of just thinking about ways to shrink that identified gap or budget deficit without actually having to make cuts to services. Next slide. And then a couple other categories for some of these primary near-term treatments. For organizations that have an active, up-to-date capital improvement planning and equipment replacement schedule, this is where they have a head start because they already know and have prioritized those pending capital projects and equipment replacement schedules, and will have a better sense of which ones might be appropriate and safe to delay versus ones that they know even in difficult times for public safety or something, may still need to go forward. So the prioritization of those is important. And then on the other side of the equation, there are revenue enhancement opportunities outside of the tough, probably not realistic ones like tax increases or rate increases, seeking and really investigating state and federal aid, both assistance directly related to this situation, for example, the Coronavirus Relief Fund that DOLA is administering right now, or existing opportunities like the Colorado Energy Office's Energy Performance Contracting Program can be a way to accomplish revenue neutral construction. So there are revenue enhancement opportunities in state and federal aid, and then revisiting billing collection practices, or making sure that you're collecting taxes, especially for self-collected sales tax entities, ensuring that those boundaries are correct and vendors aren't under reporting liabilities. Next slide. Now, these primary treatments are where to start, but for a lot of organizations, and probably especially with the severity of this downturn, they won't be enough. And so the next sort of level or prioritization are these treatments or strategies that aren't necessarily inappropriate to use, but an awareness and a real evaluation of potential risks or pitfalls is really important. So these include the tougher personnel cost reductions, like across the board furloughs and layoffs that can not only affect morale, but can potentially impact services. In the area of capital spending, it's important to consider what kind of debt restructures that you aren't making decisions today that balance the budget that end up costing more in the future, like delaying a capital project that will end up increasing repair costs or maintenance costs later. In organizational strategies, a common one that frankly is very effective is an across-the-board budget cuts. And while this can work, the awareness or caution there is across the board cuts are really disconnected from board priorities. And so if they cease to be temporary and are used for a sustained period of time, the caution is that the organization might be missing an opportunity to really assess and inventory and prioritize programs and really look and focus the priority on those that do meet those board goals and priorities. Next slide. And then a really simplified illustration of how this all goes together, and Jeff Hansen will talk about this in better detail in Golden's situation, but really combining then this model of revenue scenarios and revenue expenditure modeling from optimistic to most pessimistic, and developing this priority of these treatments or strategies, starting with the least risky, and then as the situation gets more and more pessimistic, looking at putting on the table some of those tougher, maybe riskier, more cautionary treatments. Next slide. And then finally, I just wanted to point out at gfoa.org, FFA, or Fiscal First Aid, there are all kinds of great resources, including this checklist that I really like when it comes to time, especially for some organizations that are potentially going to have to think outside the box and think about treatments and strategies they've never had to before. I like this evaluation sheet because it hits on, as you're thinking about potential strategies for you, it hits on some of these big considerations to help you prioritize which ones might be easier to use and which will be more difficult, like the legal authority to use them, or the true financial benefit of the strategy, impact to services, how feasible the strategy would be to administer and implement, and then what is the likelihood of the governing board support. So that's my piece. And next we'll talk to Jeff Hansen, Finance Director from the City of Golden.
Great. Good morning, everybody. Just sound check. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you, Jeff.
Good. Good. Glad to hear that. What I would like to do is first just briefly talk about cash flow. I know that's not on the slide, but as I was listening to the first part of this presentation, cash flow hit me as something that is important we should talk about. And so when this first started back in March, and everybody's wondering, well, what are we going to do? How much money are we going to lose? How are we going to pay the bills? And on and on and on. And we really didn't know what kind of impact we were going to be facing and stuff like that. But one of the first things we want to make sure of is we have access to money to pay our employees and pay the bills, because you want to pay your bills as a government entity because it helps those businesses stay afloat. And so one of the things that we did, we have an investment portfolio where we invest in treasuries and agencies and corporate bonds and commercial paper. And as some of those investments matured, instead of reinvesting them in the same thing, we have moved a lot of that money over the last couple months into a local government investment pool. The City of Golden uses CSAFE. There are several options there, but you still get a better rate of interest than you would at your bank, but you have more liquidity with that money. So if you don't have a LGIP and all your money's in the bank, you might want to consider that just to get a little bit more interest, but also to still have the liquidity and availability of that cash. So with that, then the bulk of my talk is about how to balance the budget and steps that Golden has taken over the last few months and what we're looking at. And with any budget process, and especially in something like this, the first question that I always look at is, what is the revenue side of the equation? And in any general budget process, how much money do we have to work with? And then we tailor the expenditures to fit within that revenue stream. So in this case, the first question is, what's going to happen to our revenues? And almost immediately in March, I'm being asked that question, and my first response was, well, if any of you have a crystal ball and you can tell me how long this pandemic is going to last and what the restrictions are going to look like, I can be more effective in telling you what it's going to do to our revenues. And obviously none of us had a crystal ball, so we made our best guesses at that point, and we continue to monitor and make adjustments to those revenue projections as we go forward. For the City of Golden, our primary revenue stream for our general fund and for our capital funds is sales tax, sales and use tax. And so what I did early on in March was I looked individually at our top 50 sales tax remitters. And I went business by business, looked at how much they remitted to us in 2019, and then made my best guess at that point what their 2020 taxes would look like. And for example, the City of Golden does tax grocery food, and knowing that restaurants were closing and restrictions on restaurants, it made sense that our grocery stores were going to see an increase in sales tax revenue, also because of the mass purchasing of toilet paper and paper towels and Kleenex, but also with the grocery food itself. So it didn't make sense to say that our entire sales tax was going to go down because of closure and economy. So by looking at individual businesses, again, grocery stores, I projected at that point in time a 10% increase over 2019 revenues. Home Depot, we have a Home Depot in Golden, and people were going to be home more with not as much other things to occupy their time. And so we project that Home Depot is going to see an increase because people can do their home improvement projects and spend time productively at home. Another one that we thought we'd see an increase is pet supplies. And we have a couple of pet stores in town. And people have adopted more pets or fostered pets, and they're buying more supplies and things like that. And we're seeing those areas come to fruition at this point, seeing an increase in those. And then the other area where we projected an increase was in businesses like Amazon and Wayfair and those online retailers. And Amazon has increased far more than I projected early on, so we're seeing that. And then on the flip side, obviously retail stores that were closed, restaurants, hotels, and other accommodations, those were definitely going to take a hit financially. So when I ran the numbers for those top 50 retailers in Golden, and that makes up over 55% of our total sales tax base. So it's a pretty good indicator of where we're at. And then I just took the balance of it and assumed across the board a 10% decrease. But when I ran all of those numbers back in March, we were looking at roughly a 7 to 8% decrease in our sales tax revenue. And then also looked at other revenue streams that are of significance and did some adjusting based on like building permits and construction related projects and where we thought those were going to go. But again, sales tax was the primary thing. So once we had an idea of what kind of revenue loss we were looking at, and when we equate about a 7 or 8% decrease, that worked out to about $1 million to $1.5 million annually in the city of Golden's budget. And so similar analysis for use tax. Then it's a matter of going to how much of that sales tax is attributable to our general fund, and 2/3 of our tax goes to the general fund, 1/3 of our tax goes to capital programs. So then it's a matter of going to the expenditure side and say realistically what type of cuts can we do to absorb that loss in revenue. And a couple of things in general, what we did back in March, and some of it was trying to be proactive, but some of it just naturally occurred, is we put a hold on training and travel and canceled any, especially out of state travel, but canceled our training budgets other than webinars and things like that. And then as we saw, most of those in-person conferences and trainings got canceled anyway or got moved to a webinar. But we are seeing a significant savings in our training and travel budgets across the board because of that. And then we also instituted what we call a soft hiring freeze, so that any vacant positions needed the city manager's approval before we could post to refill. And that was based on impact to the staff in that department and also impact to the community. But we've held several positions vacant since February or March to realize salary savings and benefit savings in that area. And the other thing is we just went out to all of our departments and asked them to just be cognizant of discretionary spending, and unless it was something that was absolutely necessary for their operation, that they hold off on it. And so we put those things in place back in March, and again, we continue to evaluate those. One comment that was made earlier, and it's on the list of potential ways to cut your budget, is across the board cuts. And personally, I am not a fan of across the board cuts. And I'll give you the best example here at the City of Golden. If we were to ask all departments to cut 10% from their budget, the police department is our biggest budget. They're $7-8 million budget. It's pretty easy for them to find 10% just in salary savings from vacancies and a few other things. But our city clerk's department is a two-person operation with very minimal expenses other than personnel. To ask them to take a 10% cut in their budget basically means cutting back hours of either our city clerk or our deputy city clerk. And the equity in those two examples is just not there to justify an across-the-board cut. So it may work in some municipalities or some government entities, but I personally am not a fan of it, and we've been fortunate that we haven't had to do that here in Golden. One other thing that we have done on the expenditure side, because for example, our community center has been closed for several months now. Our museum is closed. Some of our other parks and recreation related activities and functions have been cut, or closed temporarily. So we have looked to those employees to see if we could reassign them to other duties. And so one of the things that we have done, our golf course has been able to stay open, and rather than hire a lot of seasonal help that we typically do, we have been able to reassign employees that have been willing to do that, that would normally work at the community center, lifeguards, program instructors, even front desk people, and we have been able to reassign them to the golf course. And we have some of those people now mowing fairways and doing other things at the golf course to keep our staffing and keep the course open and doing the right things without laying off or furloughing part-time people in other areas of our operation. We have been very fortunate that so far we have not had any layoffs or any furloughs, and at this point we are not anticipating that, based on the amount of money that we need to cut out of the general fund and looking at other discretionary expenditures within the general fund. We have, under the assumptions we're working under right now, we have been able to identify relatively painless discretionary cuts in our general fund that, again, don't include layoffs or furloughs. And then the other aspect on the spending side is the capital programs, and what has already been discussed is exactly what we're doing, is look at our capital budget, our CIP, and identify what projects are very easily either cut or deferred until 2021 or even 2022. And we've been able to fairly easily identify some projects that, under our current revenue assumptions, more than cover the reduction in revenue. A couple other things that we have looked at on the capital side, and sorry, I'm going to digress a second. Here at the city, our capital budgeting philosophy is threefold. Number one, top priority in our capital budget is to pay our debt. So when we've issued debt to build capital programs and capital projects, our first priority with revenue on capital is to pay that debt. Our second priority is to maintain the assets that we have. And then third priority is any new stuff. And so the easiest look or cut on our capital side is to go to the CIP and identify what new projects were included in the 2020 budget. And those are the easiest delays or cuts. Is we're not going to build this new park in 2020. We're going to push that back to 21 or 22, whatever we need to do. And that was a significant chunk of what we needed to cut out of our capital programs. And we had a couple other projects to do that. But if this pandemic, if we have a second wave and we see more impact to our restaurants and retail, and those have to close again or something to that effect, one of the things that we have evaluated is we have an annual asphalt paving and curb gutter sidewalk concrete replacement repair program that instead of funding 100% of the budget on those, we could fund it at 70 to 80%, still maintain what we have and do the highest priority repairs and replacements, but also save some capital funds at the same time. And obviously that means we're just deferring some of that work to a future year when it's going to cost more. And our preference is not to do that, but it's another alternative. Again, if the revenue situation becomes more dire, then we still have some things in our back pocket that we can do, again, without it being overly painful. So that is really all I have at this point, and look forward when we get to questions and answers to answer anything that you may have. So I'll turn it back over to the rest of the group.
Hi, this is Cynthia again. And we also, though it's not directly related to this webinar, we at DOLA and certainly statewide in the local government finance world are talking a lot about the Gallagher Amendment and the concern specifically to those local governments that have property tax and are reliant on property tax. So the latest with the Gallagher Amendment, as the existing law exists, as existing law with no change, the timing of this is every 2 years, the Division of Property Taxation does a preliminary residential assessment rate study. Well, I guess first I should back up. I apologize for the non-finance folks. The Gallagher Amendment very generally is a constitutional amendment that requires the statewide pie of property tax to hold roughly at 45% residential, 55% non-residential, the statewide tax base. And to maintain that, every 2 years, the Division of Property Taxation will assess statewide property tax base and adjust the percentage of residential value that's taxable. And through the years, the idea then was that the residential assessment rate, this percent of value of residential property that would be taxable, would float. And then the Tabor Amendment in 1992 passed and prohibits an increase in the residential assessment rate without a statewide vote. And so consequently, through the years, in times where the residential assessment rate would have needed to increase to hold that 45-55 split, it hasn't. And the General Assembly is, instead of referring something to voters, has just held it where it is. But in years where it needed to drop, it has. And so the current residential assessment rate is 7.15. And this is an every 2 year process. So the 2021 budget, the residential assessment rate will also be 7.15. But next year, the Division of Property Taxation will do their every 2 year process of reevaluating this and doing a study on what that residential assessment rate would need to be to maintain the 45-55 split. And preliminary forecasts, and hence the concern, is preliminary forecasts are projecting that residential assessment rate is going to drop further, probably below 6%. And that would become effective for the 2022 budget year. So 2 years away. Now, there is right now moving through, and we're in the final days, I think, of this legislative session, Senate Concurrent Resolution 20-001 left the Senate and I think just got out of committee in the House. This would refer a measure to voters in November to fully repeal the Gallagher Amendment, which would, I think, essentially freeze in state law that 7.15 and hold the residential assessment rate at 7.15 and would eliminate the requirement in the Constitution to hold that pie there and potentially require the General Assembly to reduce the assessment rate. So that's the latest on the Gallagher Amendment. And I think it's Q&A time.
Great, thank you, Cynthia. We have a few questions here in the queue. One question that we got from a caller or listener is, Denver does not collect a sales tax on groceries. And the caller wanted to know how many other counties did not collect sales tax. I think Parker probably goes to the part of your presentation where you're talking about using it as a gauge of the impact. Can somebody on the panel answer the question?
Sorry, Clay, using sales tax as a gauge of the impact, is that the question?
Well, the question is how many other counties don't have sales tax on groceries?
I see. I can't speak to that off the top of my head. Cynthia, do you have any clue?
I do not have that information. However, I know of a report on the Department of Revenue's website, and I will find that and share the link in the chat.
Great, thank you. A question for Jeff. The City of Golden uses a biennial budget process. With COVID-19, has that made it easier or more difficult for you in preparing next year's budget?
We are just getting started on our 2021-2022 biennial budget process. We wait probably longer than a lot of government entities in adopting our next year budget. We don't adopt until end of March, first part of December for the budget that takes effect in January. And that gives us more historical data to project and trend. And I think that's really important this year because over the last 3 months, things have been changing so quickly. And I expect over the next several months, we will continue to see changes. We may see restaurants open up even more, or we may see them shut back down and some of those kind of things. So the longer we are able to wait to have a better handle on what our revenue stream looks like next year actually helps us in our planning process and our budgeting so that we don't have to turn around in January, February and make massive changes to our budget because of what's happened this year yet. So and as far as 2022, again, who has the crystal ball? And so we're going to make reasonable and conservative assumptions and base our budget on that. But I don't see a negative impact on a biennial budget during this time. I think it's still an effective use, and it makes departments plan more than just 1 year ahead, and it helps us better evaluate some of those departmental needs and requests. So I'm still very much in favor of the biennial budget process.
Great, thank you. Another question. Is another example of a generic treatment to suspend retirement savings matches? I can't remember if Cynthia Parker covered.
I covered that, or I believe it was a question during the generic treatment. I think that's the type of thing where there are some significant downsides and it would be longer lasting. So it would definitely be down the chain a little bit that we were talking about today. It wouldn't be an initial type generic treatment. It would be a longer term structural change. And I know with para at the state and some locals level, they're considering reducing that state contribution for long-term structural reasons, not so much the immediate crisis.
Another consideration is probably whether it's a defined contribution versus a defined benefit plan. A defined benefit like a pension, not making those required contributions or really putting off something and creating a cost down the road. Versus a defined contribution plan. Jeff, is that a strategy at the City of Golden that you've ever had to consider?
We've been very fortunate that we have not had to even consider that. I was here in Golden during the recession in 2008, 2009, and because of the way we've budgeted in the past and being relatively conservative, plus the fact that we have a very strong reserve or fund balance, we were able to absorb that recession without furloughs, layoffs, and without having to look at things like cutting our contribution to our employees' retirement accounts. And I would use something like that as a last resort, because all of us, our success depends on our people. And if we start doing things that have negative and long-term impacts on our employees, then we start losing employees. And it's hard to recover from that. So we've done everything we can to have as minimal impact on our employees as possible.
Great, thank you. Another question for Jeff. I think you might have answered this, and so if you did, maybe talk about for the future. Do you prioritize the deferment of capital over layoffs?
Well, for us, those are out of two different buckets. Layoffs are in our various operating funds, and the biggest issue with this and the revenue stream is our general fund. And so, as I just mentioned, we're doing everything we can not to negatively impact our employees, and we've been paying employees even if they've had to stay home because our facility is closed and we don't have work for them to do remotely. We're still paying them 2/3 of their salary and allowing them to use annual leave or sick leave or whatever to supplement their paycheck, so they still get a full paycheck. Capital is a totally different bucket. So our priorities on how we address the general fund is different than how we look at capital, but they're two separate discussions.
Great, thank you. Another question to Jeff. So you said you used your best judgment looking back at last year's sales tax collections, trying to figure out your revenue projections, and took your best guess. After going through that experience and seeing what the results were, what are you doing, if anything, differently to look at what could be a second wave people are talking about in the fall?
Well, at this point, it's hard to know what that's going to look like. And we just, at the end of May, we just compiled all of our April sales tax revenues April sales that we collected in May. And April was the first full month of the closures. And so we're operating a little bit in a reactive mode. And I anticipate our May sales that we collect in June are going to be similar to April. But then what are June sales going to look like now that restaurants and hotels and retail stores have been had an easing of restrictions? So right now, I'm not adjusting our revenue projections because I don't think I have enough data or enough information to make a strong, educated guess on what that change is going to look like. And the good news is we're just in June, and for us, we're on a calendar year budget. So even if in August or even September, we see that there's going to be a more drastic change, that still gives us 4 or 5 months to further cut our spending side or make a conscious decision to dip into reserves so that we're not significantly changing our operations and our impact to our employees and our citizens. So to me, it's a month by month evaluation as we see how those revenues come in.
Great. Let me ask a follow-up to that. You guys are self-collected?
Yes, we are.
So for those state-collected entities that are listening, they don't have as information as you have, so it's even earlier for them to be trying to figure out what to do for a second wave.
Yeah, and the hard part about this too is that a lot of the experts are predicting this second wave, but what remains to be seen is what the public is willing to bear as far as closures and isolations again, and that may or may not change how businesses are able to operate and what kind of support they get from the public. So, we can make our best guess as of now, but I still think it's a crapshoot on what things are going to look like 3 months from now.
Great, thank you. Anne, we just got a couple minutes. Do you have closing comments you want to make?
Yeah, thank you, Clay. And thank you to our panelists today and all those that are participating with the webinar. I want to remind you that this webinar has been recorded and it will be posted on the Resiliency Office website listed here on this slide. And we will be back in 2 weeks with a third webinar in the series, Reimagining Main Streets, and looking at examples of how communities are adapting space and their codes, regulations to support this stabilization and recovery in your commercial areas. So please join us again, and thank you all for participating. The contact information for our speakers is included. And with that, I'll conclude. Thank you all.